remember, nobody is perfect. So no need to compare, even though we inevitably will. That's okay. But just remember, nobody is perfect. There is no such thing as perfection. And just be kind to yourself. Practice self-compassion. It's okay to not know everything. You're not meant to know everything, and that's completely fine.
Hello Sabiha, how are you?
Hi, Tife. I'm doing super great. How are you?
I'm doing well.
It's very, very nice to be here. I'm excited to see where this goes today. But yeah, very excited.
All right, Sabiha, let's get to the meat of it. What is imposter syndrome? Like, technically speaking, what is it? What is the history? Where is it from? And why is it a problem?
When you think about imposter syndrome, right, it can mean so many different things, but one of the main things that imposter syndrome is really this feeling of feeling like a fraud, feeling like regardless of how qualified or knowledgeable you actually are, you still feel like a fraud, or that you're going to be exposed as that, right? And so this term was actually defined in 1978 by Dr. Pauline Clance and also Suzanne Imes. And when they came up with this term, they really were seeking, what is it that stops people from moving forward sometimes?
Yeah.
And what is it that, people are hesitant about sometimes? And they noticed that a lot of individuals were having this feeling of feeling like a fraud, and it was actually affecting their performance and affecting a lot of different areas of their life. And so imposter syndrome really does play an impact in like our day-to-days, how we show up at work, how we show up with our family, how we show up in our personal lives. And so really tackling and recognizing and spreading awareness of imposter syndrome is really significant, especially because it can help us show up in the best way possible, right? And so imposter syndrome can be used interchangeably with different terms. So that can be imposterism, fraud syndrome, imposter phenomenon, as well as imposter like experience. So those are some terms that you can use interchangeably with imposter syndrome.
Interesting. I'm so glad you went through the history and the genealogy of the term, because I think understanding the context and where it's come from and how far we've come is kind of important. But at this point, I would like to understand what really are the characteristics of imposter syndrome. Like, how do I know that I have imposter syndrome?
There a lot of different ways you can identify imposter syndrome, because especially of how it shows up in your life. So if you're feeling self-doubt, if you're constantly overachieving, if you're even sabotaging your own success. So every time you maybe make an achievement, you've gotten a promotion or something, and the first thought that comes into your mind is, oh, I got lucky. Oh, this isn't, maybe this is just meant to be. And it's like you pull away from the fact that you really achieved this, and you pull away from that fact and make it about luck, or make it about something that's not about you. And so, having this fear of also not being able to live up to expectations, right? And the uncertainty of that, berating your own performance, right? It goes back to that thought of, I just got lucky. It has nothing to do with the hard work that I put in, right? And also maybe having an inability to realistically assess your own competence and skills as well. Those are some characteristics, as well as just being disappointed all the time when you're falling short. Some of the characteristics that show up when you have imposter syndrome are some of these, because you're constantly looking for trying to get to the next best thing and never really fully happy with where you are in the present moment either. And so imposter syndrome shows up within those different frames as well.
Yeah. That's interesting. I know a couple people right now who I've worked with in the past, who I'm starting to see how, wow, that was crazy. They actually had that, and I'm sure they couldn't talk about it because they didn't want to be exposed.
Yeah.
Because that's the fear, isn't it? Sort
Absolutely.
of like a positive feedback loop.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And on that point, like, it's very, very difficult, not only for the person that's feeling imposter syndrome to really recognize that they're feeling it, but it's also then if someone else points something out, right, then that kind of validates that person is really feeling like a failure in that moment. And so there are a lot of ways, we can work around this to make sure that we're really holding the space for everyone to recognize and be aware of imposter syndrome. But yeah, these are some of the characteristics that show up, and they show up in a lot of different ways.
Right. Yeah. What are some of the causes and effects of imposter syndrome? Like, how do we even get here in the first place?
The causes go all the way back to family dynamics, family background, cultural expectations of how you've grown up, the people you've grown up around, the circumstances you've grown up in, maybe individual personality traits of perfectionism. Comparing yourself can also be a cause of imposter syndrome, constantly feeling like you're comparing yourself to others, and also comparing your success to other people's success, not ever really defining your own version of success and what that looks like. It can also show up when you're really challenging yourself and trying something new as well. And it can also show up in different gender stereotypes, whatever that may be. And so, yeah, it shows up in a lot of different areas, and a lot of the causes may be different in regards to each person and how it shows up for them. So thinking about family dynamics and family background, right? Having certain cultural backgrounds, like an Asian family background might have expectations of 3 different areas that you can be in, right? Either be a doctor, a lawyer, or something in maybe the financial area, right? But if you choose something outside of that and choose a different career path, that may be overlooked, and then you would be seen as a failure in that sense, right? And it's just a overgeneralized viewpoint of how imposter syndrome can show up maybe in an Asian household where that focuses specifically on a career path, right? And so if that person does choose a different career path and they're seen as a failure, then that imposter syndrome may show up for that person, right? In regards to in any career path that they do choose. And so they'll notice themselves shying away maybe from promotions, or maybe constantly even the opposite of that, overachieving so much to the point where they feel like they'll never get to that goal. And so they're so focused on making something perfect, right? And they're not happy. They're really unhappy with where they are. But and again, culture plays a huge part, right? Like I mentioned, in success and education and career paths, all of that. And then it goes hand in hand with that personality trait that I spoke about, perfectionism, really playing a part with how imposter syndrome relates to that, and how perfectionism can really affect how you're showing up, and how you're looking at your achievements.
Already in my mind, I'm already thinking about a bunch of people who, besides myself, obviously, and I believe some of these characteristics you mentioned are things that I have experienced in my own life and career, and in different spaces that I've been. And I know a bunch of people who would definitely, one could diagnose them with imposter syndrome. So who suffers from imposter syndrome, and do you know any maybe famous people, or maybe even yourself? You could talk about some instances where you have experienced imposter syndrome.
Yeah, first I want to make a point. So imposter syndrome is not a medical diagnosis, so one cannot be diagnosed by it. It's a syndrome that shows up, meaning that it's basically a mental pattern that shows up,
Right.
and it's a pattern within our mindset that shows up and really affects us. So we want to really be aware of thinking about, diagnosing maybe someone, right, in that sense. But really knowing that this is, just like I mentioned, that mental shift that
That's
needs
right.
to happen in order to really make sure that someone if there is imposter syndrome showing up, that we are taking care of it in the right way, and we're showing giving space to that person that may be feeling that. But on your main point of who this has shown up in, so many people, right? Like you just mentioned, 20, 30 different people that you could name that you may see this come up with, right? And so some of the most well-known people are facing this, right? Michelle Obama, First Lady of the U.S., has been feeling imposter syndrome, and she talked about this, right? And I'm going to read off a quote, actually, from Michelle Obama when she was talking about, having imposter syndrome and dealing with that. And she said, I still have a little imposter syndrome. It doesn't go away, that feeling that you shouldn't take me that seriously. What do I know?
Right, right.
I share that with you because we all have doubts in our abilities about our power and what that power is, right? So someone as powerful as Michelle Obama is having imposter syndrome. So really recognize how big this is as well, right? And Tom Hanks, Neil Gaiman, Sheryl Sandberg, Sophia Amoruso, Lady Gaga even, and Howard Schultz, Maisie Williams, Matt Higgins, Maya Angelou, and Emma Watson are one of the biggest names, right, that really show the impact of and them being super vulnerable and aware of having imposter syndrome, so that other people can feel like it's normal, which it is a normal thing. It's okay if it shows up. The main point is really spreading that awareness and having an open conversation about how imposter syndrome does show up.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing, the list you just read through, because it really shows you that if these people, who are at the top of the game, could be experiencing this feeling of I don't belong here, I'm not good enough, then everyday people like you and I should take some comfort in that information. That's really great to hear, and I think a lot of people could benefit from knowing this. Why is this important to talk about in the first place? Why do we need to know about this? Why do employers need to know about this? Why do your teammates need to know about this? Why is this even something we're talking about in the workplace?
Great question, right? So bringing awareness to imposter syndrome, like I mentioned, helps tackle it and helps really alleviate that imposter syndrome and decreases it. So a lot of reasons why it's important to talk about imposter syndrome is because it can show up in the workplace, it can show up in your personal life, it can show up in your relationships, in your family, any situation. And so noticing the characteristics, right? Having that self-doubt, it can show up in a way with self-doubt, really having this fear of uncertainty, really dealing with fear, overall anxiety even, and stress, right? So it's important to have, again, open conversations about it. It can also, in the workplace, lead to decreased job performance. And again, people shying away from promotions and really leaning towards success in their field, right? And also, it can also increase burnout and decrease retention rate at the same time. It can lead to a lot of conflicts within family when recognizing that. Dealing with imposter syndrome is one thing, right? So having difficult conversations with your family maybe. And when you notice imposter syndrome come up in family, that can be more so when you're comparing maybe yourself, right? And so when you're seeing that show up, it can really play an impact in your relationships with your family. And another way that it can show up in specifically intimate relationships, maybe that you're self-sabotaging that relationship. You're
That's true.
neglecting maybe the things that are showing up, the good things that are showing up, because you're so focused on a relationship being perfect maybe, right? And this overarching viewpoint of perfection. And then another huge point of why it's important to talk about imposter syndrome is also because social media plays the biggest part in really bringing this imposter syndrome, and a lot of people bringing it up, right? And again, it goes into comparison. It goes into that idea of perfectionism, which again is not real, right? Nothing is perfect. And we can get as close as we want to what we think is perfect, but we'll never get there because there is no such thing as perfectionism. And social media has this crazy world of just showing a side that's so different, right? And they only they may only show a side that seems happy, seems successful, seems like an overnight success even. And so someone looking at that may not recognize the hard work, the blood and tears that went into that success, right? And so that may lead to imposter syndrome, really comparing themselves to that, comparing themselves to body images even, right? Recognizing or feeling like they're not a certain body image. So that can affect their own feelings of how they're showing up as well. And so many different factors, but those are some of the main areas that, it shows up in and why it's important to show up. And of course, there are many ways to identify if you're struggling with imposter syndrome, right? Like asking yourself certain questions, like do you maybe agonize over even the smallest like mistakes or flaws in your work, right? Are you attributing your success to outside factors such as luck, or are you attributing it to your own hard work? Are you maybe sensitive to even like constructive criticism, right? Feeling very, very closed off to that feedback process. And then when you do get that feedback, feeling like it's all about you rather than a collective effort to make a certain change take place, right? And maybe the biggest point is, do you feel like you will inevitably be found out as a phony? And it goes back to that point of feeling like a fraud when imposter syndrome comes up for you. Really feeling like you're going to be found out. You're lying. You're going to be found out. People are going to find out the truth about you. Even if that's not the truth. One may not see it.
How does one overcome imposter syndrome?
One of the main things before recognizing how you can overcome it is not to diagnose the people or yourself. Just have that awareness, ask yourself questions, really recognize the imposter syndrome feelings when they emerge. Awareness is one of the biggest key points to really recognizing how you can overcome imposter syndrome. Seeking support, having open conversation with your peers, your mentors, professional help, right? Maybe a therapist, maybe a coach, just seeking that open dialogue really helps in overcoming imposter syndrome, so that you're not only talking to yourself, but you actually have other people that are around you that can show you what the truth is. So if you're in a situation, for example, at work where you feel like you're doing horrible or you're going to get fired or something very similar along those lines, and those are just thoughts, but your work is completely the opposite of that. So maybe talk to HR, maybe talk to someone that you trust and share those fears with them and really assess what the realistic aspect is, right? Are those just feelings that you're feeling, or is that reality of what's showing up? So really recognizing feelings and emotions from the reality of the situation and the fact. And then also, when you are doing tasks and doing your job, celebrate every single moment that you get a chance, because we're so focused on completing things and forgetting to sit in that and celebrating and recognizing that that is our achievement that we worked very, very hard for. So really sitting in that and celebrating. And that can be talking to a friend and sharing that achievement with them, maybe journaling about it, maybe taking yourself out to dinner, or just doing something fun that really helps you celebrate that in a way that kind of alleviates that imposter syndrome showing up. And then setting limits and boundaries, right, when it comes to overworking. So just practice setting like realistic goals, setting those boundaries, really assessing what works for you, what doesn't work for you. And also reframing the way you think about your achievements, right? Focus more on what you're learning rather than your performance, so that it becomes a process where you're focused on the journey, right? And focus on the process that's taking place rather than the results more so. And the results will come on its own. But focusing on the process allows you to really recognize the hard work you've put in as well, and are putting in your own achievements, right? It gives you empowerment again. Another one would be, remember, nobody is perfect. So no need to compare, even though we inevitably will. That's okay. But just remember, nobody is perfect. There is no such thing as perfection. And just be kind to yourself. Practice self-compassion. Rewrite your mental programs, right? This is all a mental shift that we need to have, right? Reframing that perspective, really reminding yourself that it's normal to not know everything. And that you will find out more as you progress. But it's okay to not know everything. You're not meant to know everything, and that's completely fine. Yeah, and I would say, again, circling back to the first point, just having open dialogue and spreading awareness of it are key points to really overcoming imposter syndrome.
Wow, 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 Sabiha, you've really opened my mind up to a lot of things I've been thinking about, to be honest, but I haven't really had the language for. And, which is why at No Good, we only hire experts at their work who know tons and tons about whatever it is that we'd like to learn and educate ourselves on and educate our viewers on as well. So thank you so much for taking the time. We'd love to have you back.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you for having me, and I will continue to stay up to no good. Take care.